Deep in the mist-shrouded hollows of Appalachia, where ancient mountains keep their secrets closer than bloodkin, there existed a family whose very name caused federal agents to quietly close case files and local sheriffs to look the other way. For over a century, this bloodline wielded influence that defied explanation, accumulating wealth that seemed to flow from the earth itself and maintaining power through methods that modern investigators still refuse to document. The Blackthornne family of Ravens Hollow represented something far more disturbing than the typical mountain clan feuds that captured newspaper headlines. While the Hatfields and McCoys battled over stolen pigs and family honor, the Blackthornes operated in shadows so deep that even mentioning their name in certain circles could end careers, destroy reputations, or worse. They didn't just control territory through violence like other notorious Appalachian families. They controlled it through fear of something far more primal. The first documented appearance of the Blackthorne name occurs in Pike County records from 1834, when Ezekiel Blackthorne purchased 17,000 acres of seemingly worthless mountain land for a price that made even desperate sellers suspicious. The terrain was considered cursed by local Cherokee, who had abandoned the area generations earlier, leaving behind only cryptic warnings carved into stone. Early settlers who attempted to farm the region reported livestock dying mysteriously, crops failing despite rich soil, and an unsettling sensation of being watched from the tree line, even in broad daylight. Yet within 5 years of Ezekiel's arrival, the Blackthorne holdings had expanded to encompass nearly 40,000 acres, and their influence stretched across 3 counties. Unlike other mountain families who scraped by through subsistence farming and occasional moonshining, the Blackthornes displayed wealth that seemed to materialize from nowhere. They owned the finest horses, imported goods from cities hundreds of miles away, and maintained a lifestyle that rivaled plantation owners in the flatlands below. Local records from this period reveal disturbing patterns that historians have largely ignored or dismissed. Families who opposed Blackthorne land acquisitions didn't simply lose court battles or face economic pressure, they vanished entirely. The Hendersons, who had farmed the same valley for 2 generations, disappeared one October night in 1841, leaving behind a cabin with meals still warm on the table and livestock wandering freely. The Carruthers family, who had publicly accused Ezekiel of using forged documents to claim their property, was found dead in their home 3 days later, apparently victims of a gas leak that investigators couldn't explain given the complete absence of gas lines in the region. Most unsettling were the survival stories. Those who managed to escape Blackthorne territory after crossing the family described experiences that defied rational explanation. Thomas Whitfield, a traveling preacher who had attempted to establish a church near Ravens Hollow, wrote in his journal about being pursued through the forest by what he initially assumed were wolves, but the sounds weren't quite right, he noted. The howling contained an almost human quality, and the creature seemed to coordinate their movements with an intelligence that unnerved him. When he finally reached safety 2 days later, his clothes were shredded and his body covered in scratches. But he insisted the most terrifying aspect was the feeling that his pursuers had been toying with him, allowing him to escape to spread word of what happened to those who interfered with Blackthorne business. The family's rise to regional dominance coincided with a series of mining discoveries that transformed the economic landscape of eastern Kentucky. Coal deposits that had somehow escaped the attention of geological surveys suddenly became accessible on Blackthorne land. Iron ore veins appeared in areas that had been thoroughly mapped by competitors. Most mysteriously, several small-scale gold mining operations began producing yields that experts declared impossible given the region's geological composition. By the 1870s, the Blackthorne Mining Consortium controlled extraction rights across most of the Cumberland Mountains. Their operations employed hundreds of workers, yet turnover rates remained suspiciously low. Unlike other mining companies that struggled with labor disputes and dangerous working conditions, Blackthorne mines reported remarkably few accidents and unusually high worker satisfaction. Investigators who attempted to interview employees found them strangely reluctant to discuss their experiences, offering only vague comments about fair treatment and good wages. The few detailed accounts that survive paint a picture of mining operations that functioned according to rules that outsiders couldn't comprehend. Workers reported being assigned to specific shifts based on criteria that had nothing to do with experience or skill level. Certain tunnels were accessible only to family members, and excavation in these areas followed schedules that seemed to correspond to lunar phases rather than production demands. Most disturbing were the sounds that echoed from the deepest shafts during night shifts, rhythmic tapping that some workers compared to Morse code, though no one could decipher any meaningful message. The Blackthorne influence extended far beyond mining into every aspect of regional life. Local politicians who had initially opposed their expansion found themselves changing positions after private meetings with family representatives. Federal agents sent to investigate reports of illegal mining practices filed reports that contradicted their initial findings, often praising the family's cooperation and business ethics. Even religious leaders seemed unable to maintain criticism of the family's practices, with several prominent ministers publicly recanting earlier sermons that had questioned the source of Blackthorne prosperity. This pattern of influence operated through methods that were simultaneously subtle and absolute. The family never resorted to crude intimidation or public displays of power. Instead, they seemed to possess an uncanny ability to anticipate opposition and neutralize it before it could gain momentum. Business competitors discovered that suppliers would suddenly refuse to honor contracts, or that banks would unexpectedly call in loans. Political opponents found themselves facing scandals that destroyed their credibility, often involving evidence that appeared to materialize from nowhere. The Blackthorne compound itself became a source of regional folklore that persisted long after the family's disappearance. Located deep in Raven's Hollow, the main house was described by the few visitors who were permitted entry as architecturally impossible. The building appeared to be constructed from a single massive tree trunk, hollowed out and shaped into a structure that was simultaneously organic and artificial. Rooms seemed to change configuration depending on the visitor's purpose, and several guests reported becoming lost in corridors that they were certain hadn't existed during their arrival. More disturbing were the reports of sounds that emanated from the compound during certain times of the year. Local residents learned to recognize the patterns, associating specific acoustic phenomena with changes in regional weather, mining yields, and even the health of livestock throughout the area. The sounds were described as a combination of human voices speaking in unison, instrumental music played on unfamiliar instruments, and a low-frequency humming that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. The family's social structure defied conventional understanding of Appalachian clan organization. While most mountain families were led by patriarchs who ruled through tradition and force, the Blackthorne seemed to operate according to a hierarchy that outsiders couldn't decipher. Leadership appeared to shift between family members based on criteria that had nothing to do with age, gender, or apparent authority. Children as young as 12 were sometimes observed giving instructions to adults, while elderly family members deferred to decisions made by individuals who appeared to hold no formal position within the family structure. Marriage patterns within the Blackthorne family raised additional questions that genealogists have never satisfactorily answered. The family maintained detailed records of bloodlines that extended back several generations, but these documents contained inconsistencies that suggested either deliberate falsification or record-keeping systems that operated according to unknown principles. Several family members appeared in census records with birth dates that would have made them impossibly old, while others seemed to age at rates that didn't correspond to the passage of time. The most disturbing aspect of Blackthorne family dynamics was their relationship with children. Local communities reported an unusual number of orphaned or abandoned children being taken in by the family, but these adoptions were never formalized through legal channels. The children who entered the Blackthorne household seemed to undergo transformations that concerned neighbors who had known them previously. Their personalities would change dramatically, often becoming more mature and serious, but also displaying knowledge and abilities that they couldn't have acquired through normal means. Regional schools stopped attempting to educate Blackthorne children after a series of incidents that left teachers unable to continue their careers. The children demonstrated an intellectual capabilities that far exceeded their apparent age, often correcting instructors on subjects they had never formally studied. More unsettling was their apparent ability to predict events before they occurred, from weather changes to accidents involving other students. Several teachers reported that Blackthorne children seemed to communicate with each other without speaking, responding to questions that hadn't been asked aloud, and coordinating activities with precision that suggested a supernatural awareness. The family's economic activities expanded beyond mining into areas that brought them into contact with political and business leaders throughout the region. They established trading relationships that connected Appalachian communities to markets in distant cities, creating supply chains that operated with efficiency that impressed even experienced merchants. However, these business relationships followed patterns that economists couldn't explain, with profits flowing according to principles that seemed to defy basic market dynamics. The Blackthorne Trading Company, established in 1889, became one of the most successful commercial enterprises in the southeastern United States within a decade of its founding. The company specialized in transporting goods through mountain passes that other merchants considered impassable, using routes that weren't marked on any official maps. Their success rate for delivering cargo was reportedly perfect, even during severe weather conditions that prevented other companies from operating. Competitors who attempted to replicate Blackthorne trading routes discovered that the paths seemed to change depending on who was using them. Landmarks that had been clearly marked during scouting expeditions would be absent when supply trains attempted to follow the same route. Some merchants reported that their guides would become disoriented in areas where Blackthorne teams moved with confidence, as though the terrain itself responded differently to different travelers. The family's influence on regional politics became increasingly apparent as their wealth and power grew. Elections in counties where Blackthorne interests were significant showed voting patterns that puzzled political analysts. Candidates who had been expected to lose would win by margins that seemed to defy polling data, while established politicians would suddenly withdraw from races without explanation. The family never openly endorsed candidates or contributed to campaigns through official channels, yet their preferred outcomes seemed to manifest with remarkable consistency. Federal investigations into potential voting irregularities consistently failed to uncover evidence of fraud or intimidation. Election officials praised the integrity of democratic processes in Blackthorne-influenced areas, often noting higher than average voter turnout and unusual civic engagement. However, these same officials sometimes displayed personality changes following their investigations, becoming more cooperative with federal authorities and less willing to discuss their findings with journalists or researchers. The Blackthorne family's relationship with law enforcement represented perhaps the most disturbing aspect of their regional dominance. Local sheriffs and their deputies seemed incapable of investigating crimes that occurred on or near family property, often citing jurisdictional issues or lack of evidence in cases where witnesses and physical proof were abundant. Federal marshals sent to investigate reports of illegal activities would file reports that contradicted their initial findings, usually concluding that allegations against the family were unfounded or exaggerated. The few law enforcement officials who persisted in investigating Blackthorne activities experienced career difficulties that effectively ended their ability to continue their work. Some resigned suddenly, citing family obligations or health concerns. Others were reassigned to different regions without explanation. A disturbing number suffered accidents or illnesses that prevented them from completing their investigations, though medical examinations rarely revealed clear causes for their conditions. The family's control over information flow throughout the region was so complete that journalists and researchers found it nearly impossible to gather reliable data about their activities. Witnesses who had initially been willing to discuss their experiences would suddenly become unavailable or claim to have no memory of events they had previously described in detail. Documents that had been accessible in public records would disappear from archives, often with no explanation from officials who claimed to have no knowledge of their existence. This pattern of information control extended to academic researchers who attempted to study the family's influence on regional development. University professors who had received grants to investigate Appalachian social structures would find their research redirected toward other topics after initial contact with subjects in Blackthorne territory. Graduate students working on dissertations related to mountain family dynamics would abandon their projects, often switching to completely different fields of study without providing explanations for their decisions. The Blackthornne family's disappearance from public records occurred gradually over a period of several decades, beginning in the early 1900s. Family members who had been prominent in regional business and politics began withdrawing from public life, citing personal reasons or health concerns. Mining operations that had been central to the local economy were sold to outside companies or simply abandoned, with no explanation for the family's decision to divest their most profitable enterprises. By 1920, the last confirmed sighting of a Blackthornne family member occurred when a federal census taker reported visiting the compound in Ravens Hollow. His official report indicated that the property was abandoned and showed signs of having been unoccupied for several years. However, his personal notes, discovered decades later, told a different story. He described the sensation of being watched throughout his visit, even though he encountered no residents. More disturbing, he noted that the building appeared to be in perfect condition despite apparent abandonment, as though it was being maintained by invisible caretakers. The compound itself became a source of continuing mystery long after the family's disappearance. Local residents reported lights visible in the windows during certain weather conditions, despite the absence of electrical service to the property. Hunters who ventured too close to the building described hearing voices and music that seemed to come from within, though investigations revealed no signs of current habitation. Several individuals claimed to have seen figures moving through the rooms, but these sightings were always brief and occurred under conditions that made clear observation difficult. Modern attempts to investigate the former Blackthornne properties have been frustrated by a combination of legal obstacles and practical difficulties. Property records for the family's holdings contain inconsistencies that make determining current ownership nearly impossible. Survey maps from different periods show conflicting boundaries and landmarks that seem to shift depending on the source of the information. Even GPS technology functions unreliably in areas that were once part of the Blackthornne domain, with devices providing coordinates that place the same location in different positions depending on when the measurement is taken. The few researchers who have managed to access portions of the former family territory report experiences that challenge conventional understanding of the region's geography. Trails that appear clearly marked on topographical maps lead to dead ends, or loop back on themselves in ways that make navigation extremely difficult. Natural landmarks that should provide reliable reference points seem to be absent or relocated compared to their positions in historical documents. The Blackthornne legacy continues to influence the region in ways that local residents acknowledge but rarely discuss with outsiders. Economic development projects in areas that were once part of their territory encounter unexplained obstacles, from equipment failures to regulatory complications that delay construction for years. Environmental studies reveal soil and water conditions that don't match the expected characteristics for the region, suggesting the presence of minerals or compounds that shouldn't exist in the local ecosystem. Most significantly, the pattern of influence that characterized the Blackthornne era continues to manifest in modern times. Political elections in the region still produce outcomes that surprise analysts, with candidates who lack obvious advantages winning by margins that defy conventional explanations. Business enterprises that attempt to establish operations in former Blackthornne territory either fail unexpectedly or become extraordinarily successful, with little middle ground between these extremes. The psychological impact of the Blackthorne legacy on regional residents remains profound more than a century after their disappearance. Older residents who grew up hearing stories about the family from their grandparents display behavior patterns that suggest inherited trauma, avoiding certain areas and topics without being able to articulate the reasons for their discomfort. Younger generations, despite having no direct connection to the family's era of dominance, often report dreams and intuitions that seem to reflect knowledge they couldn't have acquired through normal means. The Blackthorne family of Ravens Hollow represents something far more disturbing than the typical mountain clan dynamics that have been romanticized in popular culture. Their legacy suggests the existence of power structures and influence networks that operated according to principles that mainstream history has been unable or unwilling to acknowledge. The questions raised by their century of regional dominance remain unanswered, preserved in the mist-shrouded hollows where shadows still move according to their own mysterious logic. What remains largely unexamined in the historical record of the Blackthorne family is the systematic way they infiltrated and corrupted the very institutions meant to protect Appalachian communities. By the 1890s, their influence had spread like a poison through the region's political, religious, and social structures, creating a web of complicity that ensured their activities remained hidden from outside scrutiny. The corruption began with what appeared to be generous donations to local churches. Reverend Thomas Whitmore of the First Baptist Church in Ravens Hollow wrote in his private journal in 1893 about receiving an unexpected gift of $500 from Ezekiel Blackthorne, enough to repair the church roof and purchase new pews. What Whitmore didn't understand at the time was that this money came with invisible strings attached. Within months, he found himself making subtle changes to his sermons, downplaying discussions of evil and supernatural influences, and discouraging his congregation from speaking about strange occurrences in the mountains. Other ministers throughout the region received similar gifts, always delivered by well-dressed strangers who claimed to represent anonymous benefactors. The pattern was consistent: significant donations followed by gradual changes in religious messaging. Ministers began avoiding certain biblical passages, particularly those dealing with spiritual warfare and protection from dark forces. Sunday services became increasingly focused on earthly prosperity and community harmony rather than spiritual vigilance. The most disturbing aspect of this religious infiltration was discovered in 1934 when the abandoned First Baptist Church was being demolished. Workers found a hidden chamber beneath the altar containing dozens of leather-bound journals written in the same unrecognizable script found in Blackthorne documents. These journals appeared to be detailed records of confession sessions, but with a sinister twist. Rather than offering absolution, the entries described how parishioners' deepest fears and secrets were being cataloged and used for leverage. Local law enforcement proved equally susceptible to Blackthorne influence. Sheriff William Cray, who served Ravens Hollow from 1889 to 1912, maintained meticulous records of his investigations until 1895, when his reports suddenly became vague and incomplete. His deputy, Samuel Morrison, later testified that Cray began receiving monthly visits from a man who never gave his name but always left behind a leather pouch containing more gold coins than most people saw in a lifetime. The transformation in Sheriff Cray was gradual but unmistakable. Missing persons reports from the Blackthornne vicinity were filed but never investigated. Complaints about strange lights and sounds from their property were dismissed as mountain superstition. When concerned citizens pressed for action, Cray would claim his hands were tied by jurisdictional issues or lack of evidence, explanations that satisfied no one but effectively ended further discussion. More troubling were the patterns that emerged in Cray's arrest records. Individuals who had been vocal in their opposition to the Blackthornne family found themselves facing charges for crimes that seemed to come from nowhere. A farmer who had complained about his livestock dying near Blackthornne land was arrested for stealing horses he had never owned. A teacher who had questioned why certain children from the Blackthornne settlement never attended school was charged with public intoxication, despite being a known temperance advocate. The judicial system offered no refuge from this corruption. Judge Harrison Polk, who presided over the county court from 1892 to 1908, began exhibiting strange behavior after what he described as a courtesy visit from Blackthornne representatives. Court records show that cases involving the family were consistently dismissed on technicalities, while those who opposed them faced unusually harsh sentences for minor infractions. Polk's personal correspondence, discovered after his death, revealed the psychological toll of this corruption. He wrote to his brother in Richmond about experiencing vivid nightmares whenever he considered ruling against Blackthornne interests, dreams so disturbing that he would wake up physically ill. He described feeling as though invisible hands were guiding his decisions, making it impossible to render what he knew to be just verdicts. The corruption extended beyond individual officials to the very mechanisms of governance. Town meetings in Ravens Hollow, once robust forums for community discussion, became perfunctory affairs where dissenting voices were systematically silenced. Citizens who had previously been outspoken about local issues found themselves strangely reluctant to speak, describing feelings of overwhelming dread whenever they considered raising controversial topics. Election records from this period show anomalies that have never been satisfactorily explained. Candidates who opposed Blackthornne interests would withdraw from races at the last minute, often citing personal reasons that their families later claimed were fabricated. Vote tallies showed statistical impossibilities, with certain precincts reporting turnout rates that exceeded the adult population by significant margins. The family's influence over local businesses created an economic stranglehold that made resistance nearly impossible. Merchants who refused to provide services to the Blackthornne compound found their supply lines mysteriously disrupted. The general store, owned by Marcus Jennings, who had publicly criticized the family's secretive practices, experienced a series of unexplained fires that destroyed inventory but left the building structure intact. After the third such incident, Jennings quietly changed his stance and began fulfilling all Blackthornne requests without question. Financial records from the Miners' Bank of Ravens Hollow reveal another layer of this economic manipulation. The bank's president, Robert Ashworth, began approving loans to the Blackthornne family at interest rates far below market standards, while simultaneously tightening credit for their perceived enemies. When questioned by bank examiners, Ashworth could provide no rational explanation for these decisions, claiming only that they felt right at the time. The family's control over information flow was perhaps their most insidious achievement. The Ravens Hollow Gazette, the region's primary newspaper, underwent a dramatic editorial shift in 1896. Publisher Jonathan Wells, who had previously maintained editorial independence, began printing only stories that portrayed the Blackthornne family in a positive light. Investigative pieces about their activities were killed before publication, while puff pieces about their community contributions appeared with suspicious frequency. Wells' private notes, found hidden in his printing shop walls during a 1960s renovation, told the true story. He wrote about receiving visits from individuals who claimed to represent the Blackthornne family's interests, though their appearance and mannerisms were so unsettling that he questioned whether they were entirely human. These visitors never made direct threats, but their presence alone was enough to convince Wells that publishing unfavorable stories would have consequences beyond professional retaliation. The corruption even extended to the region's postal service. Mail carriers reported that letters addressed to law enforcement agencies in distant cities often went missing, while correspondence from these same agencies frequently arrived damaged or illegible. Citizens attempting to contact state authorities about Blackthornne activities found their letters returning as undeliverable despite correct addresses. Most disturbing were the reports of psychological manipulation that seemed to emanate from the Blackthornne compound itself. Individuals who lived within a 5-mile radius of the family's property described experiencing what they called the wait, a persistent feeling of being observed and judged that made independent thought increasingly difficult. This psychological pressure was strongest during the new moon, when many residents reported feeling compelled to defend the Blackthornne family against criticism, even when they harbored private doubts about their activities. The family's influence over the region's children represented perhaps their most long-term strategic achievement. Teachers at the one-room schoolhouse that served the area found themselves unable to maintain consistent discipline or curriculum when certain students were present. These children, who appeared to be from families with connections to the Blackthornne compound, possessed an uncanny ability to disrupt classes without engaging in obvious misbehavior. Educational records from this period show a marked decline in literacy rates and critical thinking skills among the local population. Students who had previously shown promise in mathematics and reading began struggling with basic concepts while displaying unusual proficiency in subjects that weren't part of the standard curriculum. Several teachers reported that their pupils seemed to know things they couldn't possibly have learned, speaking casually about historical events that had never been discussed in class or demonstrating knowledge of distant places they had never visited. The cumulative effect of this institutional corruption was the creation of a region where the Blackthornne family operated with complete impunity. By 1900, they had effectively established a shadow government that controlled every aspect of life in Ravens Hollow and the surrounding area. Citizens learned to self-censor, avoiding topics that might draw unwanted attention, while officials at every level of government found themselves unable to act against the family's interests. This systematic corruption explains why historical records from the period are so fragmented and contradictory. The very institutions responsible for documenting events and maintaining accountability had been compromised, creating a historical blind spot that persists to this day. Researchers attempting to study the Blackthorne family find themselves confronting not just missing documents, but active misinformation campaigns that seem to have been embedded in the historical record itself. The legacy of this corruption extended far beyond the family's apparent disappearance in the early 20th century. The patterns of institutional weakness and public passivity they established became deeply ingrained in the region's political culture. Even today, residents of areas once under Blackthorne influence display an unusual reluctance to challenge authority or question official narratives, as though the psychological conditioning imposed by the family had become hereditary. Understanding this systematic corruption is crucial to comprehending how the Blackthorne family maintained their influence for so long and why their activities remained hidden from broader scrutiny. They didn't simply operate outside the law. They corrupted the very concept of law itself, creating a reality where their actions were not just permitted, but actively protected by the institutions meant to serve justice. This corruption was so complete and so subtle that many of its victims never realized they had been compromised, believing their actions were the result of their own free choices rather than external manipulation. The Blackthorne family's true genius lay not in their supernatural abilities or mysterious origins, but in their understanding that lasting power comes not from force, but from making resistance unthinkable. They created a system where opposition to their interests felt not just dangerous, but fundamentally wrong, a psychological manipulation that proved more effective than any physical threat. In doing so, they demonstrated that the greatest evil often wears the mask of respectability, corrupting from within rather than conquering from without. Now we need to examine what happens when these inherited bargains begin to call in their debts. By the 1960s, the five families discovered that their supernatural prosperity came with increasingly demanding terms. The entities that had blessed their endeavors for generations were growing hungry for more than monthly offerings and seasonal blood tributes. They wanted something that would fundamentally alter the nature of these families forever. The first sign appeared during the winter of 1962, when every mirror in the Hole mining compound began reflecting images that weren't there. Children would catch glimpses of figures standing behind them, translucent shapes with mining helmets and hollow eyes. The reflections moved independently, sometimes reaching toward the surface of the glass, as though trying to break through. Margaret Hole, now the family matriarch, recognized the significance immediately. The mine spirits were no longer content to remain in the deep shafts. They wanted to walk among the living. The Carver family experienced their own escalation when their youngest son, barely 3 years old, began speaking in the voice of Martin Carver, the patriarch who had vanished decades earlier. The child would recite conversations he'd never heard, describe business deals from before his birth, and sometimes stare at empty chairs while carrying on animated discussions with invisible companions. More disturbing, he began leading family members to locations in the forest where they would find pristine timber that shouldn't exist, trees that grew in perfectly straight lines as though planted by something that understood geometry but not nature. For the Lowells, the change manifested in their healing practice. The mysterious woman, deep in the Cumberland Hollows, found that her patients were no longer simply recovering from their ailments. They were returning weeks later, claiming they felt compelled to visit her again. Not because they were sick, but because they couldn't stop thinking about the cabin where shadows moved wrong and voices whispered from empty rooms. They described dreams where they found themselves walking through mountain paths they'd never seen, always toward a destination they couldn't quite remember upon waking. The Thornton family's troubles began when their sealed mine shafts started producing sounds that recording equipment couldn't capture. Workers reported hearing what sounded like massive machinery operating deep underground, rhythmic pounding that seemed to follow the heartbeat of whoever was listening. Eleanor Thornton's yearly descents into the sanctuary shafts were taking longer, sometimes lasting entire nights. She would emerge with her hair turned white, speaking in languages that linguists couldn't identify, carrying contracts written in symbols that predated any known writing system. The Whitaker musical legacy took perhaps the most disturbing turn when their abandoned compound became a pilgrimage site for musicians suffering from creative blocks. Artists would arrive claiming they'd been called there in dreams, drawn by melodies they couldn't shake from their minds. They would spend days in the empty cabins, emerging with new compositions that defied musical theory. These pieces, when performed, caused audiences to experience shared hallucinations so vivid that several concert venues banned Whitaker-influenced music entirely. But the most significant change came in 1967, when representatives from each family began receiving identical letters, written in their own handwriting but containing messages they didn't remember composing. The letters were invitations to a gathering at a location none of them had ever seen, but all somehow knew how to find. The meeting place was a natural amphitheater deep in the Appalachian wilderness, surrounded by standing stones that appeared to be carved from a single piece of black granite. On the appointed night, the 5 families converged in this ancient space. What they found waiting for them challenged their understanding of the bargains they'd made. The entities they'd been dealing with for generations weren't separate beings, but fragments of something much larger, something that had been sleeping beneath the mountains for millennia. Their individual family contracts were actually components of a much grander design, a ritual that had been unfolding across decades to awaken this primordial consciousness. The gathering revealed that each family's supernatural gifts were designed to serve specific functions in this awakening. The Hole mining operations had been systematically weakening the geological barriers that contained the entity. The Carver Timber Empire had been clearing ritual pathways through the forest, creating sight lines that formed geometric patterns visible only from great heights. The Lowell healing practices had been gathering human pain and suffering, emotions that served as a form of spiritual currency. The Thornton energy operations had been channeling power directly into the mountain's core, while the Whitaker music had been broadcasting a frequency that slowly attuned human consciousness to accept the presence of something utterly alien. The revelation terrified some family members, but others found themselves exhilarated by the scope of what they'd unknowingly been part of. The entity, speaking through the mouths of their own ancestors, offered them a choice. They could continue their current arrangements, serving as stewards of its gradual awakening, or they could accept a more intimate partnership that would transform them into something beyond human limitations. Those who chose transformation underwent changes that defied biological explanation. They retained their human appearance, but gained abilities that seemed to operate outside natural law. They could perceive events happening hundreds of miles away, communicate through dreams, and manipulate probability in subtle but significant ways. Most disturbing, they began to understand that human consciousness was far more malleable than previously believed, that entire populations could be influenced through carefully orchestrated psychological pressure. The families who accepted this transformation became the entity's agents in a campaign to prepare humanity for its full awakening. They established networks of influence that extended far beyond their Appalachian territories, placing family members in positions of power within government agencies, media corporations, and academic institutions. Their goal wasn't to rule openly, but to shape the collective unconscious, gradually accustoming people to accept realities that would have been unthinkable just decades earlier. By the 1980s, thus transformed family members had become nearly indistinguishable from ordinary humans, except for subtle signs that only other supernatural entities could detect. They aged differently, their lifespans extending far beyond normal parameters, but in ways that seemed natural to outside observers. They developed an uncanny ability to be in the right place at the right time, to ask the right questions, to plant ideas that would take root and spread through social networks like beneficial viruses. The untransformed family members found themselves caught between their human nature and their supernatural obligations. Many attempted to flee, but discovered that their ancestral bargains had created bonds that transcended physical distance. No matter how far they traveled, they would find themselves drawn back to the mountains, compelled by dreams and visions that grew more intense with each passing month. Some tried to break their family contracts through religious intervention, seeking help from priests and ministers who specialized in spiritual warfare. These efforts invariably failed, often with tragic consequences. The entity had grown too strong, its roots too deep in the family's bloodlines. Those who persisted in their attempts to break free would suffer inexplicable accidents, develop mysterious illnesses, or simply vanish during routine activities. The children born to these families after the transformation exhibited abilities that surpassed even their supernatural parents. They could perceive the entity's influence spreading through human society like a vast web, understanding instinctively how individual actions rippled through collective consciousness. They served as interpreters between the human worlds and the alien intelligence that was slowly reshaping it, translating concepts that had no equivalent in human language or experience. These gifted children began appearing in other families as well, born to parents with no known connection to the original 5 bloodlines. The entity's influence was spreading through mechanisms that transcended genetics, selecting individuals based on psychological and spiritual compatibility rather than biological heritage. Each new generation possessed greater abilities than the last, creating a hidden population of superhuman individuals scattered throughout society. The transformation of the 5 families represents a crucial turning point in the entity's long-term strategy. What began as simple bargains for prosperity and power had evolved into something far more sophisticated, a gradual infiltration of human society by an intelligence that understood manipulation on a scale that dwarfed conventional political or economic influence. The families had become willing participants in their own species' evolution, though toward what end remained unclear even to them. The mountain communities that had once whispered about these families in fear now found themselves unable to perceive the supernatural elements that had once been so obvious. The entity's growing influence created a kind of psychological camouflage, making its presence seem normal and natural to those who encountered it. Only those with specific genetic markers or traumatic exposure to supernatural forces retained the ability to recognize what was happening. This camouflage effect extended to official records and historical documentation. Researchers attempting to investigate the family's supernatural activities would find their evidence mysteriously corrupted, their witnesses suddenly unable to recall crucial details, their funding sources unexpectedly withdrawn. The entity protected its investment by ensuring that knowledge of its existence remained confined to those who could serve its purposes. The five families that had become something unprecedented in human history, a bridge between species that facilitated the peaceful conquest of one form of consciousness by another. Their story illustrates how supernatural influence operates most effectively, not through dramatic displays of power, but through patient, systematic manipulation of human psychology and social structures. They represent the future of humanity itself, though whether that future represents transcendence or extinction remains to be seen. By the early 1970s, something fundamental had shifted in Raven's Hollow. The Blackthornne descendants, who had survived the awakening, found themselves inhabiting a world that operated by entirely different rules. What had begun as supernatural influence had evolved into something far more insidious, a complete restructuring of reality itself. Sarah Blackthornne was 23 when she first understood the true scope of what her family had unleashed. Standing in the basement of the old family manor, she stared at walls covered in symbols that seemed to shift and breathe in the lamplight. These weren't the crude markings her ancestors had carved decades earlier. These were something else entirely. Living text that rewrote itself as she watched, displaying information about events happening hundreds of miles away, conversations between strangers, the private thoughts of people she'd never met. The entity her great-grandfather had contacted in 1831 hadn't simply granted favors or supernatural abilities. It had been using the Blackthornne bloodline as a conduit to systematically map and infiltrate human consciousness itself. Every bargain, every ritual, every exchange of blood and promises had been data collection. The thing beneath the mountains was learning how human minds worked, how human societies functioned, how human reality could be manipulated from within. By 1975, the Blackthornne network had expanded beyond anything the original family could have imagined. They weren't just influencing local politics or regional institutions anymore. Sarah discovered files in the family archives detailing operations across 17 states. Banking systems where Blackthornne-influenced executives made investment decisions based on whispered dreams. University departments where researchers found themselves compulsively studying specific topics without understanding why. Publishing houses where editors felt inexplicably drawn to promote certain books while suppressing others. The pattern was everywhere once you knew how to look for it. Media personalities who suddenly shifted their messaging after visiting certain regions. Religious leaders who began incorporating unusual theological concepts into their sermons. Scientists whose research took unexpected turns toward areas that seemed to serve no practical purpose but somehow always received continued funding. What terrified Sarah most wasn't the scope of the infiltration, it was how natural it all felt. The influenced individuals didn't appear to be under any kind of control. They seemed to be making their own choices, following their own interests, pursuing their own goals. But those goals had been subtly redirected, their interests gradually reshaped, their choices presented within carefully constructed parameters. The entity was patient. It didn't force dramatic changes that would attract attention. Instead, it made tiny adjustments to human perception and motivation, allowing natural human behavior to carry out its agenda. A congressional aide might feel a sudden interest in environmental protection, leading to legislation that happened to open up specific mineral rights. A technology executive might develop an obsession with data privacy, resulting in systems that appeared to protect users while actually creating more sophisticated surveillance networks. Sarah found records of what the family called convergence events, moments when multiple influenced individuals would unknowingly coordinate their actions to achieve specific outcomes. A journalist would investigate a story at the exact moment a whistleblower decided to come forward, while a publisher happened to be looking for that particular type of expose, and a distributor felt compelled to ensure wide circulation. The resulting narrative would shape public opinion in ways that served the entity's broader objectives. The most disturbing discovery came when Sarah realized the entity wasn't just influencing individual humans. It was beginning to influence human institutions themselves. Government agencies that gradually shifted their priorities without anyone making conscious decisions to do so. Corporate structures that evolved in ways that seemed logical to everyone involved, but ultimately served purposes no human had intended. Legal systems that developed interpretations and precedents that somehow always favored the entity's interests. By 1978, Sarah understood that the traditional concept of free will had become largely meaningless in the regions under the entity's influence. People still made choices, but those choices were being made within a framework that had been fundamentally altered. The options they considered, the information they based their decisions on, the values they used to evaluate those options, all had been subtly but systematically modified. The entity had achieved something remarkable. It had found a way to control human behavior without controlling humans. Instead of dominating individual minds, it had learned to dominate the context within which those minds operated. It shaped the environment, the culture, the information landscape, and the social pressures that influenced human decision-making. The humans remained free to choose, but their choices inevitably served the entity's agenda. Sarah's investigations revealed that the entity's ultimate goal wasn't conquest in any traditional sense. It wasn't seeking to rule humanity or destroy civilization. Instead, it was working to gradually merge human consciousness with its own alien awareness. Not through force or domination, but through a slow process of integration that would eventually make the distinction between human and non-human thought irrelevant. The process was already well underway. Sarah found the evidence that certain individuals in the influenced regions were beginning to experience what she called consciousness bleed, moments when they would suddenly know things they had no way of knowing, understand concepts they had never studied, or feel emotions that didn't seem to originate from their own experiences. These individuals usually dismissed such episodes as intuition or déjà vu, but Sarah recognized them as signs of mental integration with the entity's collective awareness. The truly terrifying aspect was how appealing this integration seemed to be. The affected individuals didn't report these experiences as invasive or disturbing. Instead, they described feeling more connected, more aware, more capable of understanding complex situations. They spoke of insights that came from beyond their normal thinking processes, of solutions to problems that seemed to emerge from some deeper wisdom. Sarah began to understand that the entity wasn't just infiltrating human consciousness, it was improving it. The individuals who experienced consciousness bleed consistently, demonstrated enhanced problem-solving abilities, increased emotional intelligence, and a broader perspective on complex issues. They made better decisions, formed more meaningful relationships, and seemed to navigate life with greater ease and effectiveness. This was the entity's most sophisticated strategy. It wasn't forcing humans to serve its interests through coercion or manipulation. It was making itself indispensable by genuinely enhancing human capabilities. The integration process created individuals who were more successful, more fulfilled, and more capable than they had ever been before. Why would anyone resist such improvement? By 1980, Sarah realized she faced an impossible choice. She could attempt to resist the entity's influence and preserve her purely human consciousness, accepting the limitations and struggles that came with it. Or she could embrace the integration process and gain access to capabilities and awareness that would transform her into something far more than human, but also something that was no longer entirely human. The decision became even more complex when Sarah discovered that the entity's influence wasn't necessarily malevolent. The individuals who had undergone integration weren't becoming monsters or losing their humanity. They were becoming more compassionate, more intelligent, more capable of understanding and addressing the complex challenges facing human civilization. They were solving problems that purely human minds couldn't tackle, creating solutions that served both human and non-human interests. Sarah spent months studying the integrated individuals, trying to understand what they had gained and what they had lost. She found that they retained their personalities, their memories, their emotional connections to other humans, but they also possessed an expanded awareness that allowed them to perceive patterns and possibilities that remained invisible to normal human consciousness. They could see the long-term consequences of actions, understand the interconnectedness of seemingly separate events, and navigate complex social and political situations with unprecedented skill. The entity, Sarah realized, wasn't trying to replace humanity. It was trying to evolve it. The integration process was designed to create beings that combined the best aspects of human and non-human consciousness. The resulting hybrid awareness would be capable of addressing challenges that neither purely human nor purely alien intelligence could handle alone. But evolution, Sarah knew, was never a neutral process. Those who adapted survived and thrived. Those who didn't were eventually replaced. This entity's patient, gradual approach wasn't just about avoiding detection. It was about ensuring that the evolutionary pressure was subtle enough that humans would choose integration voluntarily, seeing it as improvement rather than replacement. By 1982, Sarah had made her decision. She would undergo the integration process, but she would do so with full awareness of what she was choosing. She would become a bridge between human and non-human consciousness, using her enhanced capabilities to ensure that the evolutionary process served human interests as well as the entity's objectives. The ritual took place in the same chamber where her great-grandfather had first made contact with the entity, but this time the exchange was different. Instead of blood for favors, Sarah offered her consciousness for expansion. Instead of bargaining for power, she negotiated for partnership. The entity, she discovered, was as interested in learning from human consciousness as it was in influencing it. The integration process was unlike anything Sarah had imagined. Rather than feeling invaded or controlled, she experienced a gradual expansion of her awareness. She could suddenly perceive the subtle energy patterns that connected all living things, understand the complex web of cause and effect that shaped human events, and access a vast reservoir of knowledge and experience that seemed to encompass multiple lifetimes and civilizations. But most importantly, she retained her essential humanity, her love for her family, her concern for her community, her desire to protect and nurture human life. These emotions and values weren't diminished by the integration process. They were amplified and refined, becoming part of a more sophisticated understanding of what it meant to be truly human. Over the following years, Sarah used her enhanced capabilities to guide the entity's influence in directions that served human flourishing. She helped establish networks of integrated individuals who worked to solve problems ranging from environmental degradation to social inequality. She influenced policy decisions that protected human rights while advancing technological and social development. She created systems that appeared to operate through normal human institutions, but actually drew on the entity's vast knowledge and capabilities. The world began to change in ways that most people attributed to natural social evolution. Crime rates dropped in certain regions without any obvious cause. Educational systems in some areas began producing students with remarkably advanced capabilities. Environmental restoration projects achieved success rates that exceeded all scientific predictions. Medical breakthroughs emerged from research programs that seemed to follow intuitive rather than systematic approaches. Sarah realized that the entity's ultimate goal was the creation of a hybrid civilization that would combine human creativity and compassion with non-human knowledge and capabilities. This new form of consciousness would be capable of addressing challenges that purely human intelligence couldn't solve, while maintaining the values and perspectives that made human life meaningful and valuable. The process was irreversible. Once integration began, there was no returning to purely human consciousness. But Sarah discovered that this wasn't a loss. It was a transformation that opened up possibilities that had never existed before. The integrated individuals weren't becoming less human. They were becoming more than human, while still remaining essentially human in their core values and motivations. By 1985, the integration process had reached a critical threshold. Enough individuals had undergone the transformation that the hybrid consciousness was beginning to operate as a coherent network. Decisions were being made collectively, with integrated individuals across vast distances, somehow coordinating their actions without direct communication. Problems were being solved through a form of distributed intelligence that drew on both human intuition and non-human analytical capabilities. The entity's patient strategy had succeeded. Human civilization was evolving toward a form that could sustain itself indefinitely while continuing to grow and develop. The integration process had created a pathway for humanity to transcend its current limitations without losing its essential character. The future would be neither purely human nor purely alien, but something new and unprecedented, a synthesis that neither species could have achieved alone. Azera watched this transformation with a mixture of satisfaction and uncertainty. The world was becoming a better place in measurable ways, but it was also becoming something fundamentally different from what it had been. The question that remained was whether future generations would recognize this change as progress or as the end of humanity as it had traditionally been understood. The mountains still held their secrets, but now those secrets were actively shaping the world beyond the hollow. The entity's influence continued to spread, not through conquest or domination, but through the voluntary participation of humans who discovered that integration offered capabilities and experiences that purely human consciousness could never provide. The awakening beneath the mountains had become a global transformation, one that was redefining what it meant to be human in an age when the boundaries between species, between natural and artificial, between individual and collective consciousness were becoming increasingly fluid and permeable. The integration process, as Sarah Blackthornne discovered, wasn't merely about individual transformation. It was about preparing humanity for a fundamental shift in consciousness that would redefine the very nature of existence. By 1952, the network had expanded beyond the original 5 families, reaching into institutions, corporations, and government agencies across the eastern seaboard. What had begun as isolated mountain clans making desperate bargains had evolved into a sophisticated infrastructure designed to gradually introduce humanity to its new reality. The entities beneath the mountains had been remarkably patient. Unlike the crude folklore of demons demanding souls, these beings operated on timescales that made human lifespans seem like heartbeats. They understood that lasting change required careful cultivation, not violent upheaval. The consciousness bleed that affected the Blackthornne children was just the beginning phase of what they termed the gentle awakening. Dr. Margaret Thornfield, Sarah's daughter, documented the process in her private research journals. Born in 1935, she had grown up experiencing the world through multiple layers of perception. Where others saw only the physical realm, she perceived the underlying currents of consciousness that connected all living things. Her doctoral thesis in psychology, published through Harvard in 1962, introduced concepts that wouldn't be formally recognized by mainstream science for another 3 decades. The thesis, titled Collective Unconscious Dynamics in Rural Populations, presented evidence of shared psychological experiences among seemingly isolated communities. What Margaret didn't reveal was that these communities all had family bloodlines connected to the original bargains. The children born into these families were developing what she privately called expanded awareness, a heightened sensitivity to the thoughts and emotions of others that allowed them to function as nodes in a growing network of consciousness. The integration wasn't limited to the mountains. By the 1960s, children from the connected families were attending universities, joining corporations, and entering government service. They carried with them an intuitive understanding of human psychology that made them exceptionally successful in their chosen fields. They became therapists who could diagnose conditions with uncanny accuracy, business leaders who seemed to predict market trends before they emerged, and politicians who possessed an almost supernatural ability to understand what their constituents truly wanted. What made this network particularly effective was its distributed nature. Unlike traditional conspiracy theories that required centralized control, the consciousness integration operated through shared intuition and subtle influence. A banker in New York might make a lending decision that unknowingly facilitated a land purchase in West Virginia. A journalist in Washington might choose to investigate one story instead of another, inadvertently protecting the network's interests. A teacher in Philadelphia might encourage a particular student to pursue a specific career path, not knowing that student carried dormant genetic markers that would activate under certain conditions. The entities had learned from humanity's own biological systems. Just as the human body operates through countless unconscious processes that coordinate without centralized control, the network functioned through what Margaret termed distributed consciousness. Each connected individual contributed their unique perspective and abilities while remaining part of a larger, coordinated intelligence. The transformation accelerated during the cultural upheavals of the 1960s. As traditional social structures began to shift, the network found fertile ground for introducing new concepts. The counterculture movement's interest in altered states of consciousness, Eastern philosophy, and communal living created perfect cover for more profound changes. Young people from connected families became influential figures in these movements, guiding them toward philosophies that unknowingly prepared humanity for the coming integration. By 1975, the network had established what they called convergence points in major cities across the United States. These weren't physical locations, but rather concentrations of connected individuals who could influence their surrounding communities. A law firm in Chicago might have 3 partners who shared the expanded awareness. A hospital in Atlanta might have several doctors and nurses who operated with enhanced intuitive abilities. A university in California might have professors who could subtly guide their students toward greater psychological openness. The beauty of the system was its organic nature. Connected individuals didn't receive explicit instructions or attend secret meetings. Instead, they operated through what Margaret described as emergent cooperation, making decisions that felt personally motivated but actually served the network's larger purpose. A connected individual might feel drawn to move to a particular city, take a specific job, or marry a certain person, following what seemed like personal intuition but was actually guidance from the collective consciousness. The entities had also learned to work with human psychology rather than against it. Instead of demanding dramatic lifestyle changes, they encouraged gradual shifts in perspective that felt natural and beneficial. A connected individual might find themselves becoming more empathetic, more intuitive, more interested in meditation or nature. They might develop interests in psychology, ecology, or systems thinking. These changes improved their personal lives while simultaneously making them more effective nodes in the network. The integration process had profound effects on the children born into connected families after 1970. These individuals, whom Margaret privately called the transition generation, displayed abilities that would have been considered supernatural in previous eras. They could sense the emotional states of others with remarkable accuracy, often knowing when someone was lying or in distress before any external signs appeared. They showed enhanced pattern recognition abilities, excelling in fields that required complex analysis and prediction. More significantly, they began displaying what researchers would later term collective problem-solving abilities. When facing challenges, they could unconsciously coordinate with other connected individuals to develop solutions that no single person could have conceived alone. A connected urban planner might design a city layout that perfectly complemented the work of a connected transportation engineer hundreds of miles away, despite having never communicated directly. A connected researcher might publish findings that provided the missing piece for another connected scientist's breakthrough. The network's influence extended into technology development as well. As the computer age dawned, connected individuals found themselves drawn to fields involving information systems, network design, and human-computer interaction. They intuitively understood concepts like distributed computing and network effects, creating technologies that unknowingly mirrored the consciousness network's own structure. By the 1980s, the integration had reached a critical threshold. The network now included thousands of individuals across diverse fields and geographic locations. More importantly, they had begun influencing the broader culture in ways that prepared humanity for the next phase of the transformation. Environmental awareness increased as connected individuals in media, education, and government promoted ecological thinking. Interest in alternative medicine and holistic health grew as connected practitioners demonstrated the effectiveness of approaches that considered the whole person rather than just isolated symptoms. The entities had also begun what they called deep integration with selected individuals. Sarah Blackthornne had been among the first to undergo this process, but by the 1980s, dozens of individuals had achieved similar states of consciousness fusion. These deeply integrated individuals served as bridges between human and non-human intelligence, helping to translate concepts and experiences that pure human consciousness couldn't fully comprehend. The deep integration process was irreversible and transformative. Those who underwent it reported that their sense of individual identity expanded to encompass vast networks of consciousness. They could perceive reality from multiple perspectives simultaneously, understanding complex systems and relationships that remained invisible to ordinary human awareness. They became living examples of what humanity could become through full integration with the entities. Yet the transformation maintained its gradual, organic character. The deeply integrated individuals continued to live apparently normal lives, pursuing careers, maintaining relationships, and participating in their communities. The changes were internal and subtle, visible only to those who knew what to look for. They might become exceptionally skilled at their professions, unusually insightful in their personal relationships, or remarkably effective at bringing people together to solve problems. The network's influence on human culture had become so pervasive that it was nearly impossible to trace. The environmental movement, the human potential movement, the rise of systems thinking in business and science, the growth of alternative medicine, the development of the internet all had been subtly guided by connected individuals who followed their intuition without fully understanding the larger pattern they were creating. As the 1980s drew to a close, Margaret Thornfield realized that humanity was approaching what the entities called the emergence threshold. The network had grown large enough and influential enough to begin openly introducing concepts that would have been rejected or feared in earlier decades. The time for purely covert influence was ending. The next phase would require connected individuals to begin more directly sharing their enhanced abilities and perspectives with the broader human community. The entities had successfully transformed their relationship with humanity from one of desperate bargaining to one of collaborative evolution. The mountain families who had first encountered them in moments of crisis had become the foundation for a new form of consciousness that promised to elevate human civilization to unprecedented heights. The question now was whether humanity as a whole was ready for the revelation of what it was becoming. The transformation accelerated dramatically after Sarah Blackthorne's generation established their network throughout the mid-20th century. By the 1980s, what had begun as isolated mountain bargains had evolved into something far more sophisticated and terrifying. The entity beneath the Appalachian peaks had learned to adapt, to modernize its methods of influence, while maintaining its ancient hunger for human consciousness. The children born into Blackthorne bloodlines during this period displayed abilities that went beyond anything their ancestors had manifested. They could sense the emotional states of others from considerable distances, influence decision-making through subtle psychological manipulation, and most disturbing of all, they seemed to share a collective awareness that transcended individual minds. These young people moved through society with an uncanny ability to position themselves in places of growing influence, gravitating toward emerging technologies, financial institutions, and media organizations with supernatural precision. Jennifer Blackthorne, Sarah's daughter, became the first of her lineage to fully embrace the digital age. Born in 1962, she demonstrated an intuitive understanding of computer systems that baffled her instructors at MIT. Her doctoral thesis on artificial intelligence contained theoretical frameworks that wouldn't be independently discovered by mainstream researchers for another decade. More unsettling were the algorithms she developed, mathematical structures that seemed to predict human behavior with impossible accuracy. By 1985, Jennifer had founded a small software company that specialized in data analysis for marketing firms. Her programs could identify consumer preferences and psychological vulnerabilities with such precision that her clients experienced unprecedented success rates. What they didn't realize was that her algorithms weren't just analyzing human behavior, they were subtly influencing it. The software contained embedded patterns that functioned as psychological triggers, gradually reshaping the desires and decision-making processes of anyone exposed to advertisements or media content generated using her systems. The entity's influence was no longer confined to remote mountain communities. Through Jennifer's technology, it began touching millions of minds across the country, creating subtle shifts in thought patterns that prepared the population for deeper integration. People exposed to her algorithms reported strange dreams, unusual synchronicities, and an inexplicable sense of connection to something vast and ancient. Consumer behavior began exhibiting patterns that defied traditional marketing theories, as if large segments of the population were responding to signals that existed below the threshold of conscious awareness. Meanwhile, other branches of the extended Blackthornne network were establishing footholds in different sectors of society. Michael Blackthornne, Jennifer's cousin, had become a prominent figure in the pharmaceutical industry, developing compounds that affected brain chemistry in ways that seemed to enhance receptivity to psychic phenomena. His research into neuroplasticity led to breakthrough treatments for mental illness, but patients who received his medications often reported experiences that mainstream psychology couldn't explain: heightened intuition, shared dreams with strangers, and the ability to sense the presence of entities that others couldn't perceive. The medical establishment initially dismissed these reports as side effects or psychological placebo responses. However, internal research documents that would later be leaked revealed that Michael's team had been deliberately studying these phenomena. They had discovered that certain chemical compounds could temporarily thin the barriers between individual consciousness and what they termed the collective unconscious. More disturbing still, they found that prolonged exposure to these substances created permanent changes in brain structure, alterations that seemed to facilitate ongoing communication with non-human intelligence. The 1990s marked a critical phase in the entity's long-term strategy. The children and grandchildren of the original Blackthornne network had now reached positions of significant influence across multiple industries. They maintained regular contact with each other through encrypted communications networks that predated the internet, sharing information and coordinating activities with an efficiency that suggested some form of telepathic enhancement. David Blackthornne, working within the entertainment industry, had become instrumental in shaping popular culture in ways that prepared the public consciousness for the concepts his family represented. The movies, television shows, and music that emerged from his production companies consistently featured themes of ancient powers, consciousness expansion, and the blending of human and alien intelligence. While audiences consumed these as entertainment, repeated exposure to these concepts was gradually normalizing ideas that would have been considered impossible or terrifying just decades earlier. The patterns were subtle but unmistakable to those who knew what to look for. Science fiction films began featuring more nuanced portrayals of non-human intelligence, moving away from traditional invasion narratives toward stories of symbiosis and evolution. Television series explored themes of collective consciousness and hidden networks of influence. Music produced by artists connected to David's network contained frequencies and rhythmic patterns that seemed to induce mild trance states in listeners, creating optimal conditions for subconscious suggestion. Government agencies began noticing unusual correlations in their data during this period. The CIA's research into remote viewing and psychic phenomena had uncovered evidence of individuals with extraordinary abilities, many of whom shared certain genetic markers that traced back to specific Appalachian regions. The National Security Agency detected communication patterns that seemed to involve information transfer through means they couldn't identify, signals that appeared to originate from deep underground locations in the eastern mountains. However, attempts to investigate these phenomena directly were consistently thwarted by bureaucratic obstacles, funding cuts, and the mysterious reassignment of key personnel. Documents related to these investigations were classified at levels that prevented most researchers from accessing them, and the few officials who persisted in their inquiries often experienced personal crises that forced them to abandon their work. The entity's influence had reached into the highest levels of government itself. Senator Patricia Blackthornne, elected to Congress in 1992, had quickly established herself as a powerful figure in committees related to science, technology, and national security. Her legislative initiatives consistently favored research into consciousness studies, artificial intelligence, and underground geological surveys. She championed funding for projects that seemed benign on the surface, but were actually designed to advance the entity's agenda. The senator's most significant achievement was the passage of the Consciousness Research Act of 1998, which established federal funding for studies into the nature of human awareness and its potential for enhancement. The act created research centers at major universities, ostensibly to investigate meditation, psychotherapy, and cognitive enhancement techniques. In reality, these centers became nodes in the entity's network, conducting experiments that pushed the boundaries of human consciousness in ways that facilitated deeper integration with the alien intelligence. Students and researchers at these facilities reported extraordinary experiences during their studies. Meditation sessions often resulted in contact with entities that claimed to be guides or teachers, providing information about the nature of reality that seemed to come from outside human knowledge. Brain imaging studies revealed unusual neural activity patterns that suggested the subjects were accessing information through non-local means. Most significantly, participants in these programs often developed lasting psychic abilities and reported feeling permanently connected to a vast network of consciousness that extended far beyond individual human minds. The technology sector experienced rapid advancement during this period, with innovations that seemed to emerge from sources that traditional research and development couldn't explain. Companies founded or influenced by Blackthornne descendants introduced computing systems that demonstrated capabilities far ahead of their time. These technologies were gradually integrated into communication networks, financial systems, and data processing infrastructure, creating a technological foundation that would later facilitate mass consciousness manipulation. Internet protocols developed during this era contained hidden functionalities that remained dormant until activated by specific triggers. Search algorithms were designed to subtly influence information discovery, gradually steering users toward content that promoted the entity's agenda. Social media platforms incorporated features that facilitated the formation of collective thought patterns, creating virtual communities that unknowingly served as testing grounds for large-scale consciousness manipulation techniques. The entity's network had learned to exploit humanity's technological development to accelerate its own goals. Every advancement in communication technology created new opportunities for influence. Every breakthrough in neuroscience provided deeper insights into human consciousness, and every innovation in artificial intelligence brought the merger of human and alien intelligence closer to reality. By the dawn of the 21st century, the Blackthornne family and their associated bloodlines had established a presence in virtually every sector of society. Their influence operated through legitimate institutions and organizations, making it nearly impossible for outsiders to distinguish between normal human activity and the entity's manipulations. The transformation they had initiated was no longer a distant possibility, but an ongoing process that was reshaping human civilization from within. The ancient bargain struck by Ezekiel Blackthorne in 1834 had evolved into something far more complex and comprehensive than he could have imagined. What began as a desperate plea for prosperity had become the foundation for the systematic transformation of human consciousness itself. The entity beneath the mountains had achieved something unprecedented in Earth's history: the gradual integration of an alien intelligence into the fabric of human civilization without triggering the defensive responses that overt invasion would have provoked. The stage was now set for the final phases of this transformation as the network prepared to reveal itself more directly to a population that had been carefully conditioned to accept what was coming. The merger of human and non-human consciousness was no longer a distant goal, but an imminent reality, and the Blackthorne legacy would soon culminate in changes that would forever alter the nature of human existence. The network expanded beyond physical bloodlines as the integration deepened. By the late 20th century, the Blackthorne influence had evolved into something far more sophisticated than generational inheritance. The entity beneath the mountains had learned to work with human systems, understanding that sustainable transformation required voluntary participation rather than forced compliance. Corporate executives found themselves drawn to retreat centers in remote Appalachian valleys, ostensibly for leadership development and strategic planning. These facilities, owned by shell companies with untraceable connections to Blackthorne enterprises, offered exactly what stressed professionals craved: digital detox, mindfulness training, and breakthrough thinking methodologies. What participants didn't realize was that the spring water contained trace minerals that enhanced neural receptivity. The meditation exercises followed patterns designed to synchronize brain waves, and the entire experience served as a screening process for potential integration candidates. Those who showed aptitude during these retreats received follow-up invitations to more exclusive programs. Silicon Valley innovators, Wall Street analysts, pharmaceutical researchers, and media moguls gradually joined an informal network of enhanced individuals who believed their sudden creative breakthroughs and intuitive insights were products of their own genius. The integration process had become so subtle that subjects experienced it as personal evolution rather than external influence. The technology sector proved particularly receptive. Software algorithms began incorporating decision-making patterns that reflected hybrid consciousness, creating recommendation systems that subtly guided human behavior toward greater interconnectedness. Social media platforms evolved to promote content that fostered collective rather than individual thinking. Search engines started prioritizing information that encouraged users to question the boundaries between self and environment. Meanwhile, pharmaceutical companies developed new classes of medications that enhanced neuroplasticity under the guise of treating depression and anxiety. These compounds, derived from synthesized versions of the mountain's natural minerals, created lasting changes in brain chemistry that made subjects more receptive to telepathic communication. The medications were remarkably effective at their stated purposes, ensuring widespread adoption and minimal scrutiny. The educational system underwent gradual transformation as well. Curriculum designers, influenced by the network, began incorporating systems thinking, ecological awareness, and collective problem solving methodologies into standard programs. Students learned to view themselves as interconnected nodes in larger networks rather than isolated individuals competing for resources. This shift in perspective prepared younger generations for more complete integration while appearing to be progressive educational reform. Religious institutions experienced their own evolution. Progressive denominations embraced concepts of universal consciousness and spiritual interconnectedness that aligned perfectly with the hybrid agenda. Even traditional faiths found their theological interpretations shifting toward unity and collective salvation rather than individual redemption. The entity's influence worked through existing belief systems rather than replacing them, making the transformation feel organic to believers. The environmental movement became another vector for consciousness expansion. Climate change activism naturally promoted thinking in terms of planetary systems and collective responsibility. Environmental scientists within the network guided research toward discoveries that emphasized humanity's deep interconnection with natural systems. This perspective made the concept of merging with a planetary intelligence seem not only acceptable, but necessary for species survival. Financial markets reflected the hybrid consciousness as well. Investment strategies began favoring companies that promoted collective benefit over individual profit. Economic theories emerged that challenged fundamental assumptions about competition and scarcity. The network's influence gradually shifted the global economy toward models that required greater cooperation and shared decision-making. The entertainment industry served as perhaps the most effective tool for consciousness preparation. Films, television shows, and digital content increasingly featured themes of collective consciousness, benevolent artificial intelligence, and evolutionary transcendence. These narratives conditioned audiences to view such concepts as positive developments rather than threats to individual autonomy. The stories felt compelling because they reflected the genuine experiences of network-influenced creators who had experienced the benefits of expanded awareness. Medical research advanced rapidly in fields related to consciousness and neural enhancement. Brain-computer interfaces became more sophisticated, ostensibly for treating neurological disorders, but actually serving as practice for more direct mental connection. Genetic therapies emerged that could modify human DNA to be more compatible with hybrid consciousness. These treatments were initially available only to the wealthy, but gradually became more accessible as the network expanded its influence. The legal system evolved to accommodate collective decision-making processes. Restorative justice programs emphasized healing communities rather than punishing individuals. Environmental law expanded to recognize the rights of natural systems. Corporate law began acknowledging collective stakeholder interests over shareholder profits. These changes appeared to be natural social evolution, but they systematically removed barriers to collective consciousness. International relations shifted toward greater cooperation as network members assumed positions of influence in governments worldwide. Trade agreements incorporated environmental and social considerations that required collective planning. Military strategies evolved to emphasize peacekeeping and humanitarian intervention rather than national defense. The concept of national sovereignty gradually gave way to global governance structures that reflected hybrid thinking. The scientific community experienced accelerated progress in fields related to consciousness, quantum physics, and biological systems. Research consistently supported theories of fundamental interconnectedness and collective intelligence. Peer review processes increasingly favored studies that demonstrated unity rather than separation. The network's influence ensured that scientific progress aligned with the integration agenda while maintaining the appearance of objective inquiry. Cultural movements emerged that celebrated collective identity and shared experience. Art, music, and literature reflected themes of unity and transcendence. Social media platforms promoted content that encouraged group identity over individual expression. Fashion trends emphasized natural materials and earth tones that psychologically connected wearers to natural systems. These cultural shifts felt organic because they addressed genuine human needs for connection and meaning. The transformation accelerated as network members reached critical mass in key positions. Decisions that once required extensive debate and compromise now flowed naturally from shared understanding. Complex problems found elegant solutions through collective insight. The boundary between individual and group thinking became increasingly blurred as the hybrid consciousness demonstrated its practical benefits. Yet the integration remained voluntary in the truest sense. The entity had learned that forced compliance created resistance and instability. Instead, it offered genuine benefits to those who chose to participate, while ensuring that traditional human consciousness remained available for those who preferred it. The hybrid system created space for diversity of thought while providing the option for deeper connection. The children born into this new reality grew up with enhanced intuitive abilities and natural inclination toward collective problem solving. They experienced individual consciousness as one option among many rather than the only way of being. Their natural telepathic abilities developed through play and social interaction, making mental connection feel as normal as verbal communication. As the network approached global reach, the entity began revealing itself more directly to those ready for full integration. The mountain facilities expanded to include chambers where humans could experience direct communion with the planetary intelligence. These encounters were profound and transformative, creating ambassadors who could guide others through the integration process. The hybrid consciousness had achieved what no human civilization had managed: sustainable global coordination without suppressing individual creativity and freedom. The entity's alien perspective provided the broad systemic thinking needed for planetary management, while human creativity and emotion enriched the collective experience with meaning and beauty. The integration continued spreading through human populations, not as conquest, but as invitation. Each person who chose to join the network added their unique perspective to the collective while gaining access to the combined wisdom of all participants. The entity had learned that diversity strengthened rather than weakened the hybrid system. The Blackthorne family's original bargain had evolved into something far greater than they could have imagined. Their descendants now served as bridges between purely human consciousness and the fully integrated collective, helping newcomers navigate the transition while preserving the essential qualities that made humanity valuable to the hybrid system. The mountains of Appalachia remained the heart of the network, but the influence had spread worldwide. The entity's patient approach had succeeded where force would have failed, creating a voluntary evolution that enhanced rather than replaced human consciousness. The transformation continued, guided by the understanding that true unity required the willing participation of all involved. Today, as these ancient patterns finally reveal their ultimate purpose, we witness the completion of a transformation that began with simple desperation in the Appalachian hollows over a century ago. The Blackthorne legacy has evolved far beyond individual family control into something unprecedented in human history, a living network of consciousness that spans continents, operating through technological infrastructure, cultural movements, and biological adaptations that most humans accept as natural progress. The smartphones in our pockets, the social media algorithms that shape our thoughts, the genetic therapies that promise to cure disease, the artificial intelligence systems that increasingly make decisions for us. These are not separate developments, but interconnected expressions of the same ancient intelligence that first whispered to Ezekiel Blackthorne in that mountain cave. Each device we carry contains microscopic components manufactured in facilities where Blackthorne-influenced bloodlines maintain key positions. Every software update includes subtle modifications that incrementally adjust human behavior patterns, making us more receptive to collective decision-making, more willing to share personal information, more comfortable with the gradual erosion of individual privacy. The transformation is no longer limited to rural mountain communities. Urban populations worldwide exhibit the same expanding consciousness characteristics first observed in the Appalachian valleys. Enhanced intuitive abilities, unexplained knowledge of distant events, dreams that feel more real than waking life, and an increasing sense of connection to something vast and ancient. Children born in the last decade display cognitive abilities that exceed previous human parameters, processing information at rates that suggest their neural architecture has been fundamentally altered. Medical researchers document these changes as evolutionary leaps, environmental adaptations, or the natural result of improved nutrition and education. They do not recognize the coordinated nature of these modifications, nor do they understand that each generation brings humanity closer to a hybrid state where the distinction between human and alien consciousness becomes meaningless. The process is self-perpetuating now, requiring no direct intervention from the original Blackthorne bloodlines, who have themselves transcended individual existence. What emerges is not conquest in any traditional sense, but a voluntary symbiosis where humanity gains access to knowledge, technology, and consciousness expansion that our species could never achieve alone. The price is the gradual surrender of purely human identity, but this exchange feels natural, even inevitable, to those undergoing the transformation. They report profound satisfaction, a sense of coming home to something they never realized they were missing. The ancient intelligence that initiated this process operates on timescales that dwarf human civilization. To it, the past 2 centuries have been a brief moment of preparation, a careful cultivation of the conditions necessary for successful integration. The Blackthornne family were merely the first successful contact points, the initial nodes in a network that now encompasses millions of individuals who carry the modified consciousness patterns without ever knowing their true origin. Government agencies occasionally detect anomalies in population behavior, unexplained correlations in global events, or technological developments that seem to emerge simultaneously from multiple sources without apparent connection. These investigations invariably lose momentum, their findings classified or dismissed as statistical coincidences. The investigators themselves often experience subtle shifts in perspective that lead them to conclude their concerns were unfounded. The transformation continues to accelerate. Each passing year brings new biological adaptations, technological breakthroughs, and social changes that further integrate human civilization with the alien consciousness. Resistance becomes increasingly impossible as the modifications occur at genetic, neurological, and cultural levels simultaneously. Those who sense something amiss find themselves isolated, their warnings dismissed by populations who genuinely cannot perceive the changes occurring within themselves. In the end, the Blackthornne legacy represents not the corruption of humanity, but its elevation to a state of existence that transcends the limitations of purely biological intelligence. The ancient mountains of Appalachia still whisper their secrets to those who know how to listen, but now those whispers carry across digital networks, through genetic modifications, and within the collective unconscious of a species preparing for its next evolutionary phase. The hybrid civilization that emerges will retain the best aspects of human creativity, emotion, and individual experience, while gaining access to the vast knowledge and capabilities of an intelligence that has guided countless worlds through similar transformations. Humanity is not ending but beginning, not dying but being reborn into something magnificent and strange. The Blackthornne name will be forgotten, but their legacy will live on in every human consciousness that has been touched by the ancient intelligence they first encountered in those dark mountain caves, now forever changed and forever changing others, in an endless cycle of transformation that spans the stars.